The headline was both gift and curse. In 1925, when James Buchanan Duke, founder of the American Tobacco Company and financier of hydroelectric empires, died, his only child inherited a staggering fortune. Doris Duke was 12 years old. Newspapers called her the richest girl in the world, a title that clung to her for life as persistent as any perfume. The phrase was never neutral. It carried fascination, envy, mockery. To be the richest girl in the world meant never being seen as anything else. Tabloids followed her adolescence, speculated about her suitors, catalogued her gowns. When she bought a racehorse, it was indulgence. When she traveled, it was extravagance. Even her generosity was dismissed as eccentric whim. The narrative was simple, an idle heiress destined to waste her inheritance in frivolity. Yet behind that caricature stood a young woman restless for meaning. Wealth, she discovered, was not freedom but a spotlight that blinded. If she wanted identity, she would have to carve it out against the grain of gossip. She would have to build something larger than rumor, something as enduring as stone. Doris Duke was born in 1912, the only child of James Buchanan Duke and Nanaline Holt Inman. Her father, Buck Duke, had risen from modest North Carolina roots to become a titan of tobacco and electricity. He built factories, railroads, universities. He endowed Duke University in Durham, transforming it into a Southern powerhouse. Doris's childhood was shaped by privilege but not by warmth. Her mother, Nanaline, was a social climber of formidable will, more concerned with appearances than affection. Her father, older and often absent, doted on her in ways tinged with both indulgence and guilt. When he died, leaving Doris a fortune estimated at $80 million, equivalent to over $1 billion today, the world assumed her life would be easy. But Doris quickly learned that wealth invited predators. Relatives contested wills. Strangers begged for handouts. Suitors appeared less interested in love than in access. Lawyers hovered like hawks. She developed a distrust of motives, a skepticism that would shape her relationships for decades. What she craved was authenticity. Money could buy almost everything except sincerity. Perhaps that hunger for the genuine, for things made with devotion, not calculation, explains why she was drawn so powerfully to art. By the time she was a teenager, Doris Duke was a celebrity against her will. Society columns tracked her debutante appearances, gossip magazines speculated about her future. Photographers stalked her at equestrian events. Every dress was noted, every companion scrutinized. Doris responded with a mixture of defiance and retreat. She cultivated independence, learning to surf in Hawaii, to dive with skill, to ride horses with daring. She was athletic, outdoorsy, unafraid of risk. Unlike many heiresses of her era, she did not confine herself to drawing rooms. She sought landscapes, mountains, oceans, deserts. Still the label richest girl in the world clung. She once joked, "I've always been Doris Duke and I've always been a problem." The problem was not her money itself, but the way it erased everything else she might have been. The scale of her inheritance forced Doris to confront responsibility early. She managed estates in New Jersey, North Carolina, and Rhode Island. She dealt with foundations, lawyers, tax authorities. Unlike some heirs, she did not surrender control to trustees. She insisted on learning details, signing checks, approving investments. This discipline distinguished her from the caricature of the flighty heiress. She understood that money could vanish if unattended. She also understood that money could create schools, hospitals, museums. The question was how to channel it without being devoured by it. Doris experimented with philanthropy in her 20s, supporting Duke University medical research and civic institutions. But these gestures, though generous, did not satisfy her deeper hunger. She wanted not only to fund but to build. She wanted to leave behind something stamped with her own sensibility. In 1935, Doris Duke married James Cromwell, a diplomat and socialite. The marriage was turbulent from the start, strained by differing expectations and incompatible temperaments. But it offered one unexpected gift, a honeymoon voyage that would alter Doris's destiny. The couple embarked on an extended trip through the Middle East and South Asia. They visited Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, Pakistan, and India. For Doris, these were not casual tourist stops. She immersed herself in bazaars, mosques, palaces. She lingered in courtyards tiled with mosaics in domes, where calligraphy spiraled like constellations in gardens perfumed with jasmine. In Damascus, she entered workshops where artisans hammered brass and inlaid mother-of-pearl preserving techniques centuries old. In Cairo, she stood before Mamluk mosques whose marble patterns resembled woven carpets of stone. In Delhi, she marveled at Mughal palaces where inlaid jade and lapis lazuli shimmered under the sunday. Doris was transfixed. The West dismissed Islamic art as decorative, ornamental, peripheral to serious culture. But she sensed its integrity, its mathematical rigor, its spiritual intensity. These were not trinkets, they were cosmologies rendered in geometry and color. She bought textiles, tiles, jewelry. She filled trunks with objects that spoke to her. What began as souvenir collecting grew into vocation. By the time she returned to America, the seeds of Shangri-La had taken root. In 1936, Doris Duke purchased land on the southern shore of Oahu near Diamond Head. The site overlooked the Pacific waves crashing against volcanic rock. Most visitors saw a scenic plot for a mansion. Doris saw a canvas. She envisioned a residence that would embody her encounters with Islamic art, a place where Damascus doors might open onto Persian tiles, where Moroccan arches could frame views of Hawaiian surf. It would not be a pastiche, but a dialogue, East meeting West, tradition meeting modernity, Islam meeting America. She named it Shangri-La, borrowing the term from James Hilton's novel Lost Horizon, where it denoted a hidden paradise. To Doris, Shangri-La would be not escape, but synthesis, a retreat where cultures converged. Construction began with architects who were astonished by her demands. She wanted Syrian rooms, transplanted Mughal ceilings, reconstructed Moroccan fountains installed. She hired craftsmen from across the Islamic world, bringing them to Hawaii to ensure authenticity. The process was expensive, arduous, unprecedented, but Doris insisted Shangri-La was not to be imitation, it was to be preservation. Society laughed. Newspapers called Shangri-La eccentric, bizarre, even absurd. What was the richest girl in the world doing importing tiles from Isfahan to Honolulu? Why was she not building a Newport mansion or a Fifth Avenue palace like every other heiress? To many, Shangri-La looked like Orientalist fantasy, a rich woman's exotic playground. To Doris, it was something else entirely, a sanctuary for art forms endangered by neglect, war, and modernization. She understood that traditional crafts were dying, that mosques were being demolished, that treasures risked dispersal into antique shops. Shangri-La was her answer, a place where fragments could be reassembled into wholeness. Still, misunderstanding persisted. Journalists preferred scandals, her divorces, affairs, eccentricities, to her serious collecting. Once again she was caricatured, a spoiled heiress dabbling in curiosities. The depth of her commitment, the rigor of her research, were invisible to the public eye. Yet Doris Duke pressed on. She returned repeatedly to the Middle East and South Asia, acquiring not only objects but friendships with artisans. She financed restorations of mosques, sponsored apprenticeships, encouraged continuity of tradition. She kept meticulous records documenting provenance, technique, cultural context. Unlike some collectors who stripped artifacts of meaning, Doris sought to preserve context. When she purchased an entire room from Damascus, she did not scatter its panels across different houses. She rebuilt the room in Shangri-La, preserving its unity. She believed that art must be encountered as environment, not as isolated fragments. In this philosophy, she was ahead of her time. Later, curators would emphasize immersive experiences, reconstructed environments, cross-cultural dialogues. Doris Duke was already practicing them in the 1,930 seconds and 40 seconds, decades before they became fashionable. By the late 1,930 seconds, Doris Duke had begun to articulate a vision that would outlast her marriages and scandals. She would use her fortune to safeguard beauty that the West undervalued, to offer sanctuary to traditions the modern world threatened. Shangri-La was the first manifestation, but she was already imagining more foundations, museums, networks of preservation. The richest girl in the world was quietly becoming a custodian of the world's art. When construction on Shangri-La accelerated in the late 1,930 seconds, contractors grumbled that they had never seen such plans. Mansions in Honolulu usually meant plantation-style verandas or streamlined modernist villas. Doris Duke demanded something else entirely. She wanted a Mughal-style marble bedroom with carved jali screens filtering Pacific sunlight. She wanted a Syrian room, not a reproduction, but an actual 18th-century interior salvaged from Damascus, reassembled piece by piece on Hawaiian soil. She wanted Moroccan fountains tiled with Zeliga mosaics. She wanted courtyards where calligraphic inscriptions wound around arches like vines. To achieve this, she commissioned architects Marion Sims Wyeth and Francis Blom, then overruled them whenever her instincts contradicted their proposals. She imported artisans from Morocco, Egypt, Iran, and India. She studied Islamic architectural treatises and sketched her own adaptations. The result was not a museum and not a mere mansion. It was an experiment in cultural synthesis, unlike anything in America. From the outside, Shangri-La seemed modest, low-slung white walls blending with cliffs and sea. But inside it, unfolded like a jewel box, courtyards blooming with mosaics, ceilings alive with painted stars, water features reflecting light in perpetual motion. It was at once Hawaiian and Islamic, modern and ancient, personal and universal. For Doris, Shangri-La was more than residence. It was laboratory, sanctuary stage. She lived there, surrounded by art objects that museums coveted. Breakfast might be served beneath a Syrian ceiling lunch in a Mughal garden dinner beside a pool reflecting geometric tiles. Visitors described the experience as dreamlike. You entered expecting another heiress's folly. You left convinced you had seen the future of cross-cultural design. Some critics muttered Orientalist fantasy, but others recognized that Doris had created something more radical, an immersive environment, where Islamic art was not exotic backdrop, but daily life. She herself insisted on living with art rather than treating it as decoration. Rugs were walked on ceramics, used lamps lit. Art was not to be entombed behind glass, but to breathe in conversation with human presence. Shangri-La, in this sense, was not preservation by freezing, but preservation by inhabiting. Yet the public rarely heard these nuances. To newspapers, Doris Duke was irresistible fodder, the richest girl in the world, now married, divorced, remarried, rumored in romances with actors and politicians. Reporters gleefully chronicled her yachts, her jewelry, her racehorses. When they mentioned Shangri-La, it was often with bemusement. Doris Duke's Hawaiian harem, one headline quipped. Others framed it as escapist fantasy, the playhouse of an eccentric heiress. The fact that she was engaging artisans, preserving endangered crafts, and documenting techniques interested few journalists. Doris understood this distortion, and it pained her, yet she also learned to use it. Scandal kept her name alive, which in turn made her fortune harder to ignore. If society dismissed her as frivolous, she could redirect its gaze by funding something serious. The tension between perception and reality became her constant companion. Throughout the 1,940 seconds and 50 seconds, Doris returned repeatedly to the Middle East and South Asia. She visited bazaars, commissioned works directly from craftsmen, and purchased entire architectural ensembles. She was less interested in isolated masterpieces than in environments, doors, windows, ceilings, fountains. In Iran, she acquired glazed tiles that shimmered like frozen turquoise. In India, she studied Mughal pietra dura, commissioning inlaid marble panels for Shangri-La's garden. In Syria, she rescued wooden panels at risk of destruction from urban redevelopment. She corresponded with dealers, scholars, curators, building a network that funneled endangered art into her collection. Unlike some collectors, she did not hoard pieces in storage. She integrated them into Shangri-La's architecture, ensuring they remained visible and functional. A tile panel might become a wall, a carved wooden door might swing open daily, a fountain might gurgle in the courtyard. Art lived, not languished. Doris Duke's commitment extended beyond acquisition. She funded artisans directly supporting workshops that might otherwise have collapsed. She commissioned reproductions not as fakes but as continuations of tradition, employing craftsmen to keep skills alive. When she bought a Syrian room, she also hired Syrian artisans to reassemble it, ensuring that cultural knowledge traveled with the objects. When she commissioned Moroccan mosaics, she paid tile cutters to produce new pieces in traditional methods, not machine imitations. In this sense, Shangri-La was not only preservation of artifacts, but preservation of skills. Scholars later recognized this as groundbreaking. At a time when Western museums often stripped objects from context and displayed them as curiosities, Doris insisted on context continuity craft. She anticipated debates about cultural heritage by decades. During World War II, Shangri-La became refuge. Honolulu was militarized after Pearl Harbor, yet within Doris's walls mosaics still glowed, fountains still whispered. Soldiers on leave occasionally glimpsed her estate, stunned by the sight of Mughal pavilions against Pacific surf. After the war, travel resumed, and Doris once again ventured abroad. She returned to Cairo, Damascus, Tehran, Delhi, Istanbul. Each trip added to her collection, but also deepened her understanding. She met with curators, studied manuscripts, consulted scholars. Her approach matured from passion to expertise. Meanwhile, America was changing. Post-war prosperity fueled suburbanization, consumerism, television culture. Islamic art remained marginal in public awareness. Museums focused on European masters, while Middle Eastern collections languished. Doris felt urgency. If institutions ignored this heritage, private individuals like herself had to safeguard it. By the 1,950 seconds, Doris Duke lived a double life. In tabloids, she was the glamorous heiress linked to polo players, film stars, ambassadors. In reality, she was a dedicated collector, cataloguing thousands of Islamic art objects, designing exhibitions, planning foundations. Friends recall her poring over blueprints, debating tile patterns, correcting curators. She could be imperious, exacting, impatient, but beneath the temper was conviction. Beauty mattered, preservation mattered, and money must serve both. Her Newport estate, Rough Point, embodied another side, filled with European furniture, Flemish tapestries, old master paintings. Yet even there she juxtaposed Islamic works, creating dialogues across traditions. She refused to confine herself to categories. For Doris, culture was continuum, not compartment. Critics later asked, was Shangri-La Orientalist fantasy, a Western appropriation of Islamic art? Doris anticipated this question. She acknowledged the risk, but argued that her intent was not domination but preservation. She did not display objects as exotic trophies, but as elements of living architecture. She invited scholars from Islamic countries, employed Muslim craftsmen, and maintained correspondence with cultural leaders abroad. Her motives were complex, shaped by aesthetic passion, personal identity, and, yes, privilege. But to dismiss Shangri-La as mere fantasy is to ignore her meticulous documentation, her financial support for artisans, her insistence on authenticity. She once remarked, "Beauty does not belong to one race or religion. It belongs to anyone who cares enough to protect it." For a woman caricatured as frivolous, it was a declaration of seriousness. By the late 1952, Doris Duke was already thinking beyond her lifetime. She began discussions about how Shangri-La might survive her. She consulted lawyers, trustees, museum professionals. She considered endowing a foundation specifically for Islamic art, a radical idea in America, where few institutions prioritized it. The outlines of what would later become the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art began to form. She imagined Shangri-La not as private retreat, but as public resource, a place where scholars, students, and visitors could encounter Islamic art firsthand. Yet she kept these plans quiet. To announce them publicly would have invited mockery, perhaps even opposition. She preferred to build patiently, letting her walls and courtyard speak louder than press releases. By the time Doris Duke reached her 40s, the label richest girl in the world had lost its edge. She was no longer a girl, and she had begun to recast herself not as passive inheritor, but as active patron. She remained enigmatic, guarded with journalists, mercurial with friends, unpredictable in romances. But one thread ran constant, her devotion to Shangri-La and to the rescue of Islamic art. The world might never fully understand her, but within her walls overlooking the Pacific, amid tiles from Isfahan and ceilings from Damascus, she was at peace. Here was identity, not imposed by tabloids, but chosen by conviction. Here was legacy in the making. The 1,960 seconds were a paradox for Doris Duke. In private, she was ever more immersed in her art collection, spending months at Shangri-La, refining displays, acquiring new works, and hosting scholars. In public, she was fodder for headlines, divorces, romances, lawsuits, feuds with servants, whispered scandals. Magazines relished portraying her as reclusive, eccentric, capricious. They described her changing her will dozens of times, her sudden bursts of generosity, her alleged temper. She was caricatured as the archetypal lonely heiress, rich beyond measure, poor in love. But this narrative missed half the story. Behind the curtain, Doris was laying foundations for a cultural legacy unprecedented in America. She was turning Shangri-La into a laboratory of preservation and a sanctuary for Islamic art. The 1,960 seconds were also years of geopolitical upheaval. The Middle East was convulsed by wars, coups, decolonization. Heritage sites suffered neglect, destruction, or looting. Doris saw these losses not abstractly but concretely. Workshops she had once visited, now shuttered monuments, crumbling artisans displaced. Her response was acceleration. She acquired, more determined to rescue what she could. Dealers, knowing her passion, brought her rare pieces, carved marble hallies from India, Ottoman ceramics, Persian carpets, Syrian furniture. She bought not only for beauty but for survival, convinced that if she did not, the pieces might vanish into oblivion. At Shangri-La, she incorporated them into new wings and courtyards. She did not stockpile in warehouses, she lived with them. Rooms were rearranged, fountains repositioned, ceilings repainted. Visitors described the estate as always in flux, like a living organism, adapting to new arrivals. By now, Doris Duke was no longer a mere collector, but a patron. She invited scholars to Shangri-La, allowing them access to pieces rarely seen in the West. She corresponded with curators from the Metropolitan Museum, the Smithsonian, and European institutions. She funded research trips, supported publications, underwrote exhibitions. She also opened her doors to students carefully chosen, quietly admitted. For young art historians, a visit to Shangri-La was revelation to see Islamic art not behind glass, but in situ, functioning as architecture and environment. Doris understood that scholarship was seed. Without it, her collection would remain mute. With it, it could speak across generations. In this, she anticipated the later mission of her foundation to make Shangri-La a center for education, not mere spectacle. Yet tabloid stories continued to overshadow her serious pursuits. Her brief marriage to Dominican playboy Porfirio Rubirosa fueled gossip. Her romances with surfers and athletes provided endless copy. Lawsuits with former employees painted her as tyrannical. Neighbors complained about her privacy walls, her dogs, her security. To the public, she seemed erratic. To those who worked with her on art, she was demanding but visionary. They recalled her poring over tile samples at midnight, adjusting lighting angles, correcting catalogue entries. She might cancel a dinner out of pique, but spend hours ensuring a Syrian ceiling was restored with accuracy. This duality, frivolous heiress to outsiders, serious custodian to insiders, defined her midlife. She lived in tension between spectacle and substance, and she rarely bothered to correct misconceptions. Perhaps she preferred underestimation. It gave her freedom to work unobserved. By the late 1960s, Shangri-La had become less a private home than a quasi-museum. Doris commissioned detailed inventories, professional photography, and conservation reports. She arranged objects in sequences that told stories: Mughal halis beside Indo-Persian carpets, Moroccan zellige mosaics leading into Syrian interiors. Visitors described the uncanny effect, stepping from a Hawaiian garden into a Damascus drawing room, from Pacific surf into Persian geometry. Shangri-La collapsed geography, collapsing also the West's assumptions of hierarchy. Here, Islamic art was not marginal, but central, not curiosity, but cosmos. Unlike most collectors, Doris refused to isolate masterpieces. She believed that ordinary objects, a brass ewer, a ceramic bowl, a carved doorframe, revealed as much as imperial commissions. She democratized her collection, elevating craft alongside art. Her relationship with major museums deepened. She lent works to exhibitions, supported catalogues, consulted curators. At a time when American institutions were only beginning to take Islamic art seriously, Doris Duke's collection was treasure trove. Yet she remained cautious. She distrusted institutions' tendency to strip context, to display fragments as trophies. She preferred her immersive approach at Shangri-La. Museums might show objects, but she showed environments. Still, she recognized their reach, and she used them strategically to raise awareness. Her loans often came with stipulations, proper crediting, scholarly framing, acknowledgement of cultural origins. She wielded her patronage as leverage to demand respect. By the 1972nd, academic critiques of Orientalism had emerged, questioning Western collectors' motives. Some scholars lumped Doris Duke into the category of wealthy Americans, exoticizing the East. She did not respond publicly, but her actions offered rebuttal. She funded Islamic art scholarships, employed Muslim conservators, and supported cultural initiatives in Islamic countries. She insisted that objects remain whole contexts, respected artisans, credited. She knew she was a product of her time, privileged, Western, powerful, but she also knew her intent was preservation, not plunder. Shangri-La itself testified it was not a museum of isolated spoils, but a living dialogue. Islamic art was not subordinated to Western frames, but allowed to dominate space. Doris's philanthropy expanded beyond Shangri-La. She supported medical research, environmental causes, wildlife conservation. She funded AIDS research in the 1,980 seconds long before it was fashionable. She gave millions quietly, often anonymously, but art remained her most personal commitment. Other causes mattered, but Shangri-La was her soul. When illness or scandal drove her into retreat, she returned to its mosaics, fountains, and domes. There she found coherence. By the late 1,970 seconds and 80 seconds, Doris Duke was an aging figure, eccentric recluse, to tabloids patron saint, to art historians. She continued to acquire, though less aggressively. She focused more on conservation, restoration, and planning for the future. She quarreled with trustees, revised her will repeatedly, distrusted even close associates. Yet she also worked meticulously on ensuring Shangri-La would become public resource. She endowed her foundation with clear instructions: preserve the estate fund, Islamic art, educate. She knew her reputation might never be rehabilitated in tabloids, but she hoped that future generations would see through the gossip to the legacy. By the time she entered her 70s, Doris Duke had amassed one of the world's largest private collections of Islamic art, over 4,500 objects spanning centuries and regions. Shangri-La was unlike any estate in America, a living museum of Islamic design in Hawaiian paradise. Her fortune, once symbol of idle wealth, had been transformed into cultural capital. She had turned inheritance into preservation, gossip into guardianship. She had rescued traditions at risk of erasure, and she had planted them in American soil. The richest girl in the world had become at last something richer, a custodian of worlds. By the 1,980 seconds, Doris Duke was a paradox made flesh. She was in her 70s, a woman who had once been splashed across society pages for her beauty, her marriages, her travels. Now she lived increasingly in seclusion, yet her name never left the press. The tabloids feasted on her eccentricities, endless lawsuits, bitter quarrels with servants, rumors of paranoia. They photographed her in oversized sunglasses, a frail silhouette, far removed from the glamorous richest girl in the world. Journalists wrote of her changing her will dozens of times, of alienating friends, of a lonely heiress surrounded by lawyers. But beneath these headlines, another Doris persisted, the meticulous custodian of Shangri-La, the patron planning a legacy. The public saw decline. Scholars and conservators saw determination. Even in frailty, she was working to secure the future of Islamic art. Wealth had always attracted lawsuits, but in her later years they multiplied. Former employees claimed mistreatment, associates accused her of breach of contract, relatives argued over her intentions. Doris responded with ferocity. She hired and fired lawyers, rewrote wills, and shifted trusts. This paranoia was not groundless. She had seen fortunes, squandered collections, dispersed legacies diluted. She feared that Shangri-La, without her vigilance, might be carved up, its treasures auctioned. She fought to design structures that would outlast such threats. Her distrust extended even to intimates. She suspected betrayal in kindness, ulterior motives in advice. It was lonely, but it sharpened her resolve. Better to be guarded than gullible. Better to be remembered as difficult than to be forgotten entirely. The 1,980 seconds press loved to portray her as reclusive, eccentric. They described her keeping camels on her New Jersey estate, dressing in bizarre outfits, indulging in fad diets. Some of these stories were exaggerations, others true, but they missed the deeper irony that Doris Duke had always been eccentric because she refused to play the expected role. An heiress was supposed to preside over balls, sponsor operas, live in Fifth Avenue palaces. Doris preferred surfing in Hawaii, buying Syrian ceilings, funding AIDS research, adopting rescue dogs. Eccentricity in her case was simply independence. In her final decades, Doris broadened her philanthropy. She funded research into AIDS when the disease was stigmatized, donating millions through her foundation. She supported environmental conservation, wildlife protection, and medical science. She also funded Islamic architecture conservation projects abroad, including restorations in Morocco and Egypt. Even as her health faltered, her money moved in defense of beauty. Her fortune was not a frozen inheritance, but a living current, redirected constantly toward preservation. At Shangri, Doris continued refining. Conservators worked on tile repairs, scholars catalogued manuscripts, architects updated structural supports. She supervised from wheelchairs or beds, still insisting on precision. Visitors who gained access, rare in these years, described the experience as uncanny, an aging woman surrounded by turquoise tiles, issuing orders about lighting angles, while outside waves battered volcanic cliffs. To walk through Shangri-La in the 1,980 seconds was to witness both fragility and endurance, Doris's body failing, her vision intact. Journalists labeled her lonely. She had no long-lasting marriage. Her only child died in infancy. Her family ties were strained. She spent holidays with dogs, employees, and occasionally friends. But loneliness can be misread. Doris did not crave society's approval. She craved purpose. And she found it not in cocktail parties, but in mosaics, fountains, manuscripts. Shangri-La was her companionship. Its domes and courtyards listened without betrayal. Its objects demanded care, not gossip. In a sense, she was never alone. She lived with 4,500 voices of artisans across centuries. By the early 1,990 seconds, Doris Duke was in her 80s, frail but still combative. She had undergone multiple surgeries, battled depression, and relied heavily on nurses and aides, yet she remained alert to detail. Her will was revised again, stipulating endowments for the Doris Duke Foundation, for Islamic art, for medical research, for the arts. She wanted Shangri-La preserved as a public resource, open to scholars and eventually to the public. She wanted her foundation to fund exhibitions, research, and conservation worldwide. Her estate planning was labyrinthine, but at its heart was clarity. Her money should rescue what mattered. On the 28th of October 1993, Doris Duke died in Los Angeles, aged 80. The tabloids announced it with their usual relish, the end of the richest girl in the world, the lonely heiress, the eccentric recluse. But scholars knew another story had ended the life of America's most important patron of Islamic art. Her death unleashed chaos. Her will was contested. Her estate, estimated at $1.3 billion, became battleground. Lawyers feasted, relatives fought, trustees clashed. For years, the Doris Duke estate was tied up in litigation, but slowly her intentions emerged intact. Shangri-La was secured for the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art. Endowments were protected for medical, environmental, and cultural philanthropy. What gossip had dismissed as paranoia proved prescient only by constant revision and vigilance had Doris safeguarded her legacy. In 2002, nearly a decade after her death, Shangri-La opened to the public as a museum. Visitors arrived by bus from the Honolulu Museum of Art, entered through discreet gates, and found themselves in paradise: Persian tiles, Syrian woodwork, Moroccan courtyards, all overlooking the Pacific. For many, it was revelation. Few Americans had ever seen Islamic art on this scale in such immersive context. Shangri-La demonstrated that Islamic design was not relic but living heritage resonant in Hawaiian light. Critics who had mocked Doris Duke as eccentric re-evaluated her. Scholars hailed her foresight, her commitment to authenticity, her role in rescuing endangered traditions. The heiress caricature faded, the patron emerged. Today, multiple Doris Duke foundations operate. Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art, based at Shangri, funding exhibitions, scholarships, residencies. Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, supporting performing arts, environmental conservation, medical research, and child well-being. Together, they distribute hundreds of millions of dollars, ensuring that Doris's fortune continues to flow where she directed it. Her name, once tabloid punchline, now adorns scholarly grants, theater programs, conservation reports. The richest girl in the world had become posthumously one of America's most significant philanthropists. What does it mean to rescue Islamic art? For Doris Duke, it meant using wealth not to accumulate status but to preserve voices. It meant building Shangri-La not as fantasy but as sanctuary. It meant living with mosaics, daily funding craftspeople, supporting scholarship. Historians now see her less as eccentric than as visionary. She anticipated global conversations about cultural preservation, cross-cultural dialogue, and post-colonial ethics. She recognized that art is not marginal luxury, but essential memory. Her life, riddled with contradictions, offers enduring lessons. Wealth does not guarantee happiness, but it can guarantee preservation. Reputation may be distorted, but legacy can outlast gossip. Shangri-La stands as proof. By the end of her life, Doris Duke had become a myth, heiress, recluse, eccentric. But the truth was both simpler and grander. She was a woman who refused to be only what headlines demanded. She was a patron who used fortune as shield for fragile traditions. She was a custodian who believed that beauty deserved guardians. And though her body rests in obscurity, her courtyards in Honolulu still gleam, her fountains still murmur, her mosaics still sing. In them, Doris Duke lives. When Doris Duke died in 1993, journalists rushed to summarize her life. Most fell back on the cliché that had haunted her since childhood, the richest girl in the world. Obituaries lingered on scandals, romances, lawsuits, eccentricities, far more than on mosaics or manuscripts. To the casual reader, she remained an enigmatic recluse, a lonely heiress with too much money and too few friends. But time is a curator. As years passed, another narrative surfaced. Scholars began to assess her collections, her philanthropy, her meticulous planning for Shangri-La. They discovered not a caricature, but a patron. They saw that Doris Duke had spent 6 decades quietly rescuing traditions that museums neglected and the public ignored. Her reputation began to shift. She was not simply a headline, she was a steward of heritage. The opening of Shangri-La to the public in 2002 marked a turning point. Visitors who expected an heiress's fantasy encountered something else, a coherent vision of Islamic art arranged with respect and care. They walked through Syrian rooms glowing with inlaid wood, Mughal arches framing the Pacific, Moroccan fountains singing beneath Hawaiian palms. The experience dissolved stereotypes. For many Americans, it was their first immersive encounter with Islamic design. Shangri-La reframed Islamic art not as exotic curiosity, but as architectural language, as rigorous as any Gothic cathedral, as luminous as any Renaissance fresco. Scholars marveled at Doris's foresight. She had built not a pastiche, but a sanctuary, preserving not only objects, but contexts. She had anticipated by decades the museum world's turn toward immersive displays and cross-cultural narratives. Through her estate, Doris endowed the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art, DDFIA. Its mission was clear: preserve Shangri-La and support broader engagement with Islamic art and culture. Since its founding, DDFIA has funded exhibitions across America, supported residencies for artists, and sponsored scholarships for researchers. It has enabled traveling shows of Islamic calligraphy, ceramics, and textiles. It has brought contemporary Muslim artists to Shangri-La to create new dialogues with its historic collection. In this way, Doris's fortune continues to function as she intended, not static wealth, but dynamic preservation. Each grant extends her reach. Each residency renews her vision. Doris Duke's philanthropy did not stop at Islamic art. Through her larger charitable foundation, her money continues to support performing arts, environmental conservation, child welfare, and medical research. Opera companies, jazz musicians, wildlife sanctuaries, pediatric clinics all bear traces of her legacy. But Shangri-La remains the most personal expression. It is where her eccentricities crystallized into vision, where gossip gave way to architecture, where an heiress became a guardian. Critics still debate, was Doris Duke's project, Orientalist, was Shangri-La, an act of appropriation, a wealthy woman's exotic playhouse? The answer depends on lens. Yes, she was a privileged Westerner, collecting from cultures under colonial strain. Yes, her estate reflects her own taste, not democratic consensus. Yet she also funded artisans, respected provenance, preserved environments, and refused to treat objects as trophies. She blurred categories patron and collector, student and employer, outsider and custodian. If Orientalism is caricature, Doris Duke's practice was closer to collaboration. Her legacy is not without flaws, but it resists dismissal. What myths must be dismantled to see Doris Duke clearly? Myth 1. She was frivolous. In truth, she was disciplined, strategic, and intentional. Her collections were documented with rigor, her philanthropy structured with foresight. Myth 2. She was lonely. While she lacked lasting marriages, she lived surrounded by communities of artisans, scholars, and conservators. Shangri-La itself was her lifelong companion. Myth 3. She was eccentric without cause. Her eccentricities were often the visible form of independence. Refusing conventions, she built a life on her own terms. Breaking these myths reveals a different figure, a woman who used inherited fortune not to gild herself, but to shield beauty. Today, Shangri-La receives thousands of visitors each year. Scholars consult its archives, artists create in its courtyards. Students learn that Islamic art is not peripheral, but central to global culture. At a time when misunderstandings about Islam remain rife, Shangri-La offers counter-narrative that Islamic heritage is luminous, intricate, mathematical, spiritual. Doris Duke's vision has outlived her gossip. Her estate speaks louder than any scandal. Her legacy also speaks to broader lessons. Wealth can be preservation, not just indulgence. Identity can be chosen, not dictated. Art can be bridge, not wall. Stand on the terrace of Shangri-La at sunset. The Pacific glows gold. The calligraphy on tiles catches light. The fountains murmur. You are in Hawaii, yet also in Damascus, Delhi, Fez. Cultures converge, distances collapse. This is Doris Duke's achievement, not escape from reality, but reweaving of worlds. She turned inheritance into stewardship, loneliness into sanctuary, scandal into legacy. She rescued Islamic art not by locking it away, but by giving it home. The richest girl in the world has become in memory something else. The woman who proved that beauty deserves guardians, that preservation is a daily verb, and that art, like water, must be allowed to flow. That is the meaning of Shangri-La and the rescue of Islamic art.